Imagine it's 2007 again. You are a 15-year-old boy, vaguely right-leaning, but mostly disengaged from politics. You sit down at your computer one day to play the hit new video game Bioshock. You've been looking forward to Bioshock. All your favourite game magazines have been raving on about how great it is, and how it has this meaningful message about society to tell. Also, none of your mates have played it. They won't understand. They're not real gamers like you. This makes you feel special. So you start the game up, and this is how it introduces itself to you.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, rapture can become your city as well.
And you listen to this garbage, smitten by the sheer high-mindedness of it, and think, hey, that sounds reasonable.
Bioshock's whole deal is trying to use video game storytelling in a way that's actually pretty unique at the time. Irrational Games, headed by Ken Levine,
We will get to him.
went for a piece of honest-to-God political critique which, while not unheard of at the time, didn't exactly mesh with the kind of financially successful mainstream shooters of Bioshock's caliber. At least I don't think it did. I'm probably wrong. Leave my comments alone. It's a pretty good game. Very deep and atmospheric, and the writing's pretty clever for the most part. But it's this level of direct political engagement that ended up being seen as the game's legacy. Bioshock wears its political game label on its sleeve. Its setting is a product of pure ideology. Its characters are defined by their beliefs and how their beliefs fit into the world around them. It is a cautionary tale about the nature of power and the strength of personal convictions. It's a bold, unflinching look into the inner workings of right-wing political philosophy that completely falls apart. It doesn't really work. The game fails so badly at producing any meaningful critique at all that it ends up almost promoting the very ideas that it claims to criticise. And I, because I hate myself and I've clearly never seen a comment section, I'm going to try to explain why. Let's dive in, shall we? Great. I don't know how to do this.
Part 1. Who is Andrew Ryan? Hey, remember the sweaty weirdo I made you listen to in the intro? The one with the penchant for selling terrible ideas to edgy teenagers. That would be Andrew Ryan, one of the game's principal antagonists and the founder of Rapture, the underwater city that the game is set in. I want to start this, whatever this is, by talking about Ryan specifically, because the way Irrational wrote this character plays into some larger points about their approach to political commentary. So let's have a look at him first. Right, so who is Andrew Ryan? Well, for one, he is a sworn objectivist. Objectivism, a branch of right-wing libertarianism popularised by Ayn Rand's novels around the 1950-ish, is roughly defined by a laissez-faire approach to capitalism, including extreme hostility towards regulation of any kind, and an emphasis on individualism and personal responsibility. At the core of all this is the mantra of rational self-interest, the idea that unrestricted pursuit of financial profit is something of a moral imperative. Our boy Andrew is fully on board with this line of thinking from the start, and like any successful objectivist, he has a natural talent for incredibly deep-sounding and often weirdly persuasive pseudo-intellectual drivel. His vision for Rapture was that of a
Safe! Space!
Sanctuary for businessmen, artists, and scientists, where he and other terrible garbage people like him could live free of the tyranny of basic regulatory oversight. Like, for example, the kind that would stop them kidnapping other people's children and turning them into slave zombies. Like any true objectivist, Ryan values above all else free enterprise, hard work, and whatever it is that he thinks intelligence is. Thing is, he's also got something of an authoritarian streak. He indulges heavily in propaganda and scapegoating tactics and has a history of responding violently to political dissent.
It's like I don't even recognize Rapture no more. I hear they've been rounding up people in Paula Square. I asked Ryan how could he do such things to innocents. He said, innocents. If they haven't chosen to defend Rapture, they've chosen to side with Atlas and his bandits. So there are no innocents.
Also, by the time you meet him, he has started keeping a collection of crucified bodies outside his office. You know, just to really drive the point home. He then orders the player to smash his head in with a golf club, because, I guess to prove a point about free will. Okay, no, I'm being unfair. The way the game talks about player agency using free will as a thematic device is really clever, and therefore not relevant for the purposes of this extremely one-sided teardown. Anyway, the game ends after this scene. Trust me, you can turn it off now. Okay, so we know about Andrew Ryan, we know his history, his motivations, what he gets up to in the game, and that doesn't really answer the question, does it? Who is Andrew Ryan?
Don't ask questions no one can answer. Okay. That was an Atlas Shrugged reference. I know most of you haven't read the book, and those who have wish they hadn't. That's not going to stop me feeling clever. Oh, please, do I have to talk about Atlas Shrugged now?
Part 2. Who is Atlas Shrugged? Ayn Rand's magnum opus, the favourite book of right-wing ideologues and teenage rationals alike, is the foundational work of objectivism. It's the very text that Bioshock is trying to take on, one that it often subtly references.
So I apologise in advance, but I guess we need to take a look before we continue. Oh.
Atlas Shrugged follows the story of Dagny Taggart, a woman trying to build a train line as the entire world conspires to stop her. But then that gets magically resolved after a time skip a third of the way through the book, and then the plot moves on to some other rubbish. It's one of the unintentionally funniest things I've read in a while, for many reasons, and if I were to go through the whole book here with you, there's a good chance I would never finish my first video, so I'm skipping the summary for today. Feel free to look it up on Wikipedia or something. Okay, here's two of my favourite out-of-context quotes, but that's it.
The diamond band on the wrist of her naked arm gave her the most feminine of all aspects. The look of being chained. What? Of course it's blood, thought Eddie Willers, because blood is supposed to feed, to give life, and that is what Wyatt Oil had done. What?
Instead, I want to tell you about one very specific aspect of the experience, the juicy character writing. The various supermen that make up the main cast, as well as Rand's aforementioned self-insert leading lady, are all characterized in a particular way. They all share a set of values that, honestly, make them come across as kind of sad, shallow weirdos. They're obsessed with making money, even though they themselves admit that they don't really need it. Their hoarding of capital is ideological, the one true virtue they admit to having, but that's not what makes them interesting. The interesting part is that most, if not all of Rand's protagonists are deeply unhappy. They are tortured by a sense of emptiness as they continue their battle against the world, a battle that you might suspect is happening entirely inside their heads. And they fail miserably at all human relationships as they carry their spectacular persecution complex into all their interactions with other people. They are lonely, and they have decided that the problem is everyone else, that everyone around them is stupid or cowardly or incompetent, that they are the only intelligent people left on the planet, that they are left carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. And no, I'm not extrapolating from subtext here. This is all very explicitly stated through the characters' lengthy internal monologues. And I'm going to say something controversial now. I think the protagonists are at least somewhat justified in their misanthropy. And the reason why I think that is the same reason they've got. It's everyone else. The world as it is presented here is a hellscape of malice and incompetence. All governments are hideously corrupt and intent on passing one nonsensical piece of legislation after another, on top of nationalising all private ventures. Hagrid, Dagny's incel of a business partner, has a family so emotionally abusive, it's no wonder the guy turned out the way he did. The writers and philosophers frequenting rich people's parties are all vapid, self-centered nihilists. Every minor character that's been put in charge of anything at any point is defined by an unwillingness to accept responsibility for their job.
Filthy bastard Tommies! I hate them!
And at the centre of all this stands Jim Taggart, the de facto antagonist who serves as a personification of everything wrong with this ridiculously crafted world. Jim is the brother of Dagny Taggart and is the official head of the train company which Dagny effectively runs. He is corrupt, incompetent, and bases his entire business management strategy on nepotism. Jim is also ugly, has a bad posture and a receding hairline. He hangs out in overpriced bars where he complains about the drinks and talks politics with his friends whom he secretly hates. The book makes it clear that Jim is, and has always been, a petty coward, as small-minded and loathsome a guy as they come. In fact, Rand hates Jim so much that she makes sure you know that even his girlfriend is ugly and they don't know how to have sex properly. Jim is presumably a socialist, though Rand was smart enough to never explicitly call him one. She instead gives him a set of contradicting and easily dismissed beliefs that, thanks to his frequent and poorly argued rants about the public good and antisocial behaviour, places him vaguely to the left of the other characters. Jim Taggart exists to represent the political opposition to Rand's ideas, but he has been given no ideas of his own, no coherent set of beliefs rooted in real-world politics. He is a lazy strawman whose sole purpose is to support the book's thesis.
Right, are you ready for the hot take?
Part 3. The Hot Take.
Andrew Ryan is Jim Taggart.
Bear with me here. I'm not saying that Andrew and Jim are similar characters or that they represent the same ideas. I'm not even saying that any of the parallels between them are deliberate. Andrew Ryan, even if you ignore his name, is clearly meant to be a representative of the hyper-competent Superman from Rand's book, which Jim most definitely isn't. What I'm trying to say is a bit more convoluted than that.
Ayn Rand never pretends that Jim Taggart is anything other than a not very smart person that she, the author, isn't very fond of. He is less of a character and more of a convenient device for her to vent about what she thinks people who disagree with her are like. You know that feeling you get when you're in the wrong and someone calls you out on your bullshit? Jim is this feeling personified. He is the caricature of your critic that you briefly create in your head to convince yourself that you are right, and they are nothing but a smug hypocrite. Except most people that realise they are being silly, apologise and move on with their lives. Rand turned this feeling into a whole character, complete with a name, a backstory, and an ugly girlfriend.
I'm starting to get the impression that this book isn't so much trying to tell a story as it is a vehicle for Rand's own ill-conceived hot takes. Maybe writing wasn't the best career for her. Maybe she should have tried making YouTube videos.
So, what about Randy Andy, Bioshock's very own hot take factory? Unlike Taggart, who does not have a coherent ideology, Ryan does a pretty good job of more or less accurately representing objectivist ideals.
I believe in no God, no invisible man in the sky. But there is something more powerful than each of us, a combination of our efforts, a great chain of industry that unites us. But it is only when we struggle in our own interest that the chain pulls society in the right direction. The chain is too powerful and too mysterious for any government to guide.
His hot takes about the Great Chain and Sweat aren't bad because Ken Levine is trying to give himself an easier time debunking them. They're bad because the very belief system they are built on is backwards garbage. This is the first major hurdle that Bioshock stumbles on. The decision to make Ryan's rhetoric rooted in real-world political ideas, the decision that Rand was smart enough not to make with Daggett, means that any criticism needs to be actively engaging with said ideas. Luckily, the writers at Irrational gave themselves an easy out from having to deal with all that nonsense by making Ryan into a murderous monster, turning all potential critique of objectivism contained within into a critique of just this one character. As a result, Ryan and Taggart end up serving the exact same purpose in their respective stories. They exist as a representation of the ideas that the works are trying to criticize, and as far as representations go, neither is particularly charitable. Both Atlas Shrugged and Bioshock resort to the age-old tactic of projecting the entirety of the thing that they don't like onto an irredeemable asshole that they've invented and then proceed to attack this asshole while pretending that the thing that they are doing here is real criticism. But it's not real criticism. These two characters are little more than bad strawmen that exist only so that their erratic behaviour can be made to support the author's pre-existing conclusions. There is, however, one crucial difference between the two. You see, Jim Taggart is never allowed to bear the full brunt of what passes for social commentary with Rand. Her story is filled with miniature Jim Taggarts, legions of disposable characters ready to monologue about their personal philosophies for pages at a time at the drop of a hat. They have just enough of a presence in the book that the reader can take them seriously, but always argue their case just badly enough that Rand gets to swoop in and destroy them with facts and logic. This sounds laughable, and for the most part is, but there is one chapter in particular where this approach pays off for Rand. Hank Reardon's wedding anniversary party is even more jam-packed with these single-use sock puppet characters than the rest of the book, all spouting the same tragic takes about what Rand thinks artists, philosophers, and politicians think. But then, a guy named Francisco the Anconia confronts Jim Taggart. Up until now, Francisco has been presented as the platonic ideal of the Randian Superman, a menacing presence whose unpredictable actions have been shaping the book's events. What follows is a prototype for the familiar mantra about why socialism doesn't work, and why there are no better alternatives to libertarian capitalism. It's beat for beat the same speech you have heard from right-wing politicians, conservative family members, centrist friends, your own stupid teenage mouth. And it's the first time the message of Atlas Shrugged becomes convincing. It is convincing because the book has by now spent over 140 pages defining its warped ideas about what socialism even is, establishing a dystopian nightmare of a world in dire need of being fixed by Rand's personal ideology. The speech works, because within this world, it makes perfect sense. It is impossible to debunk it without first thoroughly deconstructing every piece of world building that has led up to it. Atlas Shrugged isn't a good piece of political critique. What it is closer to an excellent work of propaganda. The bad faith tactics it employs are used with purpose. They are supported by character writing and world building at every step. Yet for some reason, Bioshock, with its lofty ambition of taking on Rand's work in a meaningful way, often resorts to using the same tactics. It offloads everything it has to say about objectivism onto just one character, then makes sure the player never has to fully engage with anything this character has to say because, hey, this guy is a bad egg. It doesn't matter how damaging his actual ideas are. Andrew Ryan never gets his anniversary party moment. His ideas are never confronted or debunked in the same way Jim Taggart's are. Ryan gets to repeat his hot takes unchallenged over and over until the very moment of his death. Part 4. The Marketplace of Ideas. I've heard some people argue that objectivism is so inherently absurd that it simply debunks itself if you let it. This is provably not true. In fact, I'm about to prove it in a bit, but let's talk about where this line of thinking comes from first. The argument is derived from the Marketplace of Ideas, an inexplicably popular liberal fallacy which states that if you leave good ideas to circulate freely in a thought environment resembling the free markets, their natural objective goodness will carry them to the top, while bad ideas will be exposed for what they are and debunked. Look, at this point, I really shouldn't need to explain why this is bad and doesn't work. It's the kind of thinking that makes some people genuinely believe that giving Nigel Farage a primetime spot on LBC is a responsible use of the platform. So I'm just going to skip over that There are other, better YouTubers that have already tackled this topic in more depth, and this script is already getting too long. Leave me alone. The point I'm trying to make is this. If you approach it from at least a slightly critical, or maybe even a leftist perspective, Atlas Shrugged reads like the most scathing takedown of objectivism ever written. But Atlas Shrugged was never intended to be read by leftists. So the thing is, was Bioshock? I mean, I have my doubts. A first-person shooter game from 2007 doesn't seem like it would have been made with a core audience of anything other than teenage boys in mind, but that's just me being presumptuous. The game is thought of by most people as an anti-objectivist critique, but when you get down to it, it's almost unsettlingly easy to read Bioshock in ways that make it come across as anything but that.
Let me give you an example. So far I've been avoiding getting into the topic of Bioshock's setting and how it feeds into its political message, so let's do that now. I'm going to talk about one of the most universally criticised aspects of Bioshock's narrative. Let's talk about the Little Sisters and the choice you get between saving and harvesting the little shits.
For those of you who haven't played Bioshock, Little Sisters are the slave zombie children I have briefly alluded to back in part 1. Their role in Rapture is to produce a substance called Adam, a magical superpower juice that is at the centre of the villain's financial interests and the city's downfall. In effect, they can be seen as something of a metaphor for the antagonist's abandonment of humanity in pursuit of profit. Early in the game you encounter one of these children and are given a choice between magically turning it back into a human child, or killing it and harvesting it for resources that make your survival in Rapture easier. From that point onward, you get to repeat the choice every time you encounter one of these spooky children, usually as a reward for overcoming one of the game's more difficult combat encounters. The choice sets itself up as one between prioritising your own survival versus your humanity. You can either do the cruel, calculating thing and receive a tangible mechanical advantage, or you can choose to not murder children and get to not feel like a complete monster, and a bunch of otherwise unobtainable superpowers as a reward for your altruism, and enough resources to completely offset any advantage harvesting the Little Sisters might get you. And the good ending.
Hang on, I'm starting to think there's an objectively better decision to make here.
The whole idea of a moral choice falls apart the moment you realise that there is a very clear correct option to be made. Not just ethically within the game's fiction, but also mechanically. And if that's the case, why give the player a choice in the first place? Because here's the kicker. The idea of the pragmatic, self-serving approach always amounting to the correct ethical stance is more or less directly transplanting the objectivist interpretation of morality into the game's mechanics. The correct solution to the puzzle of whether to rescue or harvest the Little Sisters is to act in your rational self-interest, to prioritise neither your principles nor your needs, but investment. It boils down what could be a test of the player's willingness to bend their moral compass into a financial transaction.
Okay, well that's a cherry-picked example of a badly gamified piece of narrative design, and besides, everyone else has already dunked on Bioshock's moral choice mechanics already, so it's hardly a fair target. So what else have I got?
What about the setting itself, you might ask? What about the tale of Rapture's downfall and the shambles you find the city in at the start of the game? What about the havoc that the superpower juice market wreaked on the inhabitants' minds and bodies? If that isn't meant as a warning against the excesses of unregulated capitalism, then what is? And yeah, that is a valid way to look at it. It's just one of the many ways to look at it, and it's not the one that the game seems to encourage. Take, for example, this article published by Ars Technica in 2016.
Alright, Jan, what is this? Okay. But it isn't the idea of working towards self-interest that brings Rapture down. Oh, really? Nor is Bioshock necessarily the scathing critique of objectivism as which it is so often portrayed. Instead, as is often the case, what destroys Rapture is succinctly summed up by that most famous of sayings: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Ultimately, it is Andrew Ryan and his abandonment of objectivism that brings Rapture to its knees. Because objectivism is so good.
That's right. According to this clever boy, the downfall of Rapture wasn't caused by a lack of regulation. It wasn't the corrosive, self-destructive ideology that shaped the inhabitants' worldviews and behaviour. The problem was that the higher-ups didn't stick to their ideology rigidly enough. The article goes on to say that it was in fact Andrew Ryan's obsession with power alone that destroyed the city. I wonder what might have given them that idea. Then there's this libertarian blog I found at the Pit of Snakes that is the first page of Google search results that makes the fascinating observation about how the inhabitants of Rapture brought their predicament onto themselves by not being rationally self-interested enough when they abused the superpower juice that gives you superpowers, because apparently having superpowers isn't in one's rational self-interests. Or how about this 2009 article by Seamus Young, in which a self-described objectivist Young has decided to interview for some reason goes as far as to defend Ryan's actions, claiming Ryan was driven into a corner by the secondary villain Frank Fontaine and given no choice but to blatantly abuse his power and turn Rapture into a dictatorship. Okay, no, I know this is funny, but it's not entirely wrong. Fontaine does have a lot of agency over the story, and he even gets to be the final boss of the game, so maybe there's something to this. In fact, none of these readings are necessarily wrong. They are fully supported by the text, because the text never takes up a clear position when it comes to the ideas it supposedly criticises. The people spreading them are bad news, sure, but their beliefs are plastered all over the city in big golden letters. Levine and his team did not think it was necessary to actively criticise the object of their criticism, instead opting to present it like this.
On the surface, the parasite expects the doctor to heal them for free, the farmer to feed them out of charity. How little they differ from the pervert who prowls the streets looking for a victim he can ravish for his grotesque amusement.
Bioshock communicates most of its backstory through audio diaries, and many of them sound like the one you've just heard. The recording presents real-world political beliefs, the kind held by a surprising amount of real people. They are pretty horrific beliefs, slightly exaggerated for effect here, but mostly left floating around unchanged and unopposed, presumably so that they could debunk themselves in the free marketplace of ideas. Except they didn't debunk themselves. They turned into the game's most quotable lines, its most memorable moments, the bulk of its marketing efforts. So you can see why I think the game's anti-objectivist message may have gotten somewhat distorted. Unless of course I'm misjudging the developer's intent, and the game isn't supposed to be anti-objectivist at all.
I'm sure that's not it. That's just silly.
Part 5, Bioshock 2.
Hang on. Why did I say intent? No!
Okay. So far I've been working with weird readings that more or less completely ignore authorial intent, but now that I've opened this can of worms, that's what we're doing. Granted, short of asking the criminals responsible, I have no way of knowing what Bioshock might be trying to say, and how much that aligns with what players have taken it to mean, so the best I can do here is semi-informed guesswork.
And sure, you can argue about whether me guessing at the possible intentions of people I've never met is even necessary or helpful, if you're a boring person, but I would still like to know what was going on inside the minds that spawned this dumpster fire. Are we on board? Yeah? Cool.
Bioshock 2 has something of a reputation with the fans of the first game. Its story follows up from where the original ended, but introduces a new, socialist-adjacent villain this time? Or something? I'm not really sure. The politics of this game are really confusing, and Bioshock 2 has been criticised left for resorting to bad both sides are equally wrong kind of centrism that makes it look like the South Park of video games. If we look at Bioshock 1 as a self-contained critique of right libertarianism, a pretty big if, but stay with me, then the sequel seems like its whole thesis goes, yeah, but what about the left? At worst, it reads like a borderline Thatcherite rebuttal of the original game. Sure, Andrew Ryan's Rapture was bad, but what about the alternative? I want to give the writers a bit more credit than that though, so I'm going to do a small thought experiment. Bear with me for a moment. A thing you may or may not have noticed is that the game has something of an Orwellian vibe to it.
This is Dr. Sophia Lamb with a message for the people. Remember, Big Sister is always watching.
The script and the art direction tend to lean pretty heavily into 1984's aesthetic, which, on one hand, is a pretty clear downgrade from the first game's unique Art Deco-infused style, but it's at the very least pretty okay at getting across the image of a totalitarian dystopia. So, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that the writers had actually read and understood Orwell, that they didn't just default to using grey uniforms and Big Brother iconography to represent an evil leftist regime because the name of the party in 1984 had the word socialism in it, while somehow also missing the whole point about words losing meaning that the book was making. Let's pretend that Bioshock 2 was intended to be an underwater reenactment of Animal Farm, a book also written by Orwell, but this time pretty explicitly about left-wing authoritarianism. The whole point of Animal Farm is that authoritarianism exists on a separate axis from the left-right spectrum, and even good political ideas are not immune from developing into oppressive systems if active steps are not taken to prevent it. So, is this what Bioshock 2 is trying to say? Is it treating the ideology of post-Andrew Ryan Rapture as good in principle but mishandled and misused by its new villainous leader? And this is a bit of a leap, but hear me out. Is Bioshock 1 trying to do the same thing? I've started this spiritual journey making a pretty big assumption. I've assumed that Bioshock was intended to be critical of objectivism, while the sequel tries and fails to counter this with its own critique of the left. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe the intent behind both games was to depict a world in which what they perceived to be good ideas were handled by the wrong people. Maybe the fact that Bioshock never actually criticises and indeed often seemingly promotes libertarian ideals, while instead offloading all responsibility for Rapture's downfall onto Andrew Ryan, is meant to say that objectivism in Rapture was a good idea implemented poorly. Take this with a pinch of salt though, this is all just speculation, and I'm kind of bending over backwards to find a thematic link between two games that weren't even written by the same people, so I'm probably wrong about all this, and
I'm fascinated by objectivism. I think the problem with any philosophy is that it's up to people to carry it out. It could have been objectivism, it could have been anything. It's about what happens when ideals meet reality. If you had to sum up Bioshock's story, that's what it is.
Part 6. The World Underwater.
Here's Jacob Rees-Mogg coming up. How do you feel today, Jacob?
How do I feel? Feel?
Feel, that's the word I'm looking for.
It's not a matter of feel, is it really? It's about details of policy and politics.
What you've just heard was a clip of a reporter for The Guardian attempting to interview Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg. He continues to ramble on about Brexit after this, but I found this particular moment to be a beautiful illustration of the objectivist mindset. Objectivist ideology sells itself on the aesthetic of rationality, and for this aesthetic to work, feelings have to be removed from the equation. When Rees-Mogg says it's not about feelings, it's because his worldview has taught him to always present a facade of calculating unemotional logic. He won't answer the question about how he feels because feelings don't factor into rational thinking. Except they do. Emotional appeal is at the heart of all political messaging, and the idea that emotions have been somehow completely filtered out of one's decision-making is ironically one of the most viscerally appealing sentiments in all of politics. Objectivism is particularly effective at weaponizing this appeal, at perpetuating its own flawed ideological assumptions under the guise of intellectualism. Its adherents sincerely believe that they are, well, objective. They can get away with justifying bad ideas and destructive behaviors. After all, they've arrived at them using logic, not feelings. In their heads, the bad ideas are treated as good ideas because, according to their bulletproof objective reasoning, there is no alternative. These appeals to rationality do little more than hide the fact that objectivism is, at its core, illogical, and objectivists are often fiercely anti-intellectual. Even Atlas Shrugged, the foundational text of this train wreck of a belief system is built entirely out of bad faith arguments, punctuated with instances of the author's shockingly poor understanding of the world and a disdain for the people in it. Objectivism holds little to no merit. It should be the easiest thing in the world to comprehensively debunk, and yet Bioshock either refuses or simply fails to do that. In an article for the Space Commune, Alex Banerjee-Topoulos used Facebook analytics data to sort people active in various game fandoms based on what the aggregate algorithm identified their personal politics to be. I highly encourage you to give the article a read, it's good stuff. I have reached out to Alex while writing this conceptual art piece, and he was kind enough to walk me through his process on top of providing some of the more detailed figures on a number of games, including Bioshock. See, when I first started working on this YouTube video, I was ready to conclude by saying that Bioshock's failures as a critique of right-wing ideas serve to further promote and spread those ideas. I was 15 when Bioshock came out, and at the time, I found myself pretty convinced by what Andrew Ryan had to say. And given how little resistance to his rhetoric the game put up, I find it difficult to believe that my experience was unique in this regard. So I was all but ready to declare the whole thing a piece of accidental objectivist propaganda and call it a day. But Alex's data threw a spanner in my works.
So according to this, the people that like Bioshock are pretty low in terms of being likely to be conservative compared to all these other franchises.
Okay.
However, Bioshock fans are very likely to be in the center of all the 80 things I looked at. So centrist I put as either they're listed as conservative, moderate, or just liberal, but not very conservative, very liberal. So they have one of the highest percentages of fans that are within that middle zone.
Yeah. As it turns out, the game isn't all that popular with conservative types after all. It does, however, have a sizable audience of what Facebook labels as moderates. More than most games, in fact, by enough of a margin that it can be easily identified as an outlier.
And I don't think that's even cherry picking. I think Bioshock's an outlier with the number of centrists that like it. And not centrists necessarily in radical centrists, but people either who are not very conservative, moderate, or not very liberal, and just it's a comforting tale for people that are in that zone. It's something that kind of reinforces their worldview.
The way Bioshock uses a single character to carry the responsibility for the destruction of an entire society, while thoroughly ignoring the implications baked into the ideas that got him there, is not accidental. It is a necessary measure, keeping the game's message digestible for its core audience. It needed to feel reassuring to the kind of people that believe in things like the marketplace of ideas, people who trust above all else that reason and logic is on their side, people who put their faith in the system and fetishize personal responsibility. Centrists, in other words. Bioshock doesn't fail as a work of critique because it accidentally spreads dangerous ideas. It fails because it refuses to challenge its audience. It takes a politically charged topic and proceeds to sandpaper away any hint of systemic critique, any sliver of an idea that could alienate players by going against the dominant cultural narratives. But our dominant cultural narratives are in themselves pretty objectivists. Deregulation, privatization, corporate tax cuts, financial policies that cause worldwide recessions, environmental policies that enable the fossil fuel industry to set the entire planet on fire. These are all rooted in the same ideas about personal responsibility and rational self-interest championed by the likes of Andrew Ryan and Rand's sprawling cast of ethically transcendent supermen. The problem is, real-life objectivists are much less content than the fictional ones to leave the society which they have projected behind to found their own utopias. Instead, their legacy was to turn the entire world into Rapture, to drag everyone else under the sea with them. What I'm saying is that Rapture wasn't built underwater. It'll sink when we're done melting the polar ice.
This is where Bioshock, a liberal critique of objectivism, falls flat. Liberalism, unlike objectivism, isn't inherently destructive, at least not to the same extent. And liberal critiques aren't necessarily worthless. It's just that liberalism is the ideology of maintaining the status quo. And as a result, it's woefully ill-equipped to deal with ideas so formative of what the current status quo is. The fatal flaw of Bioshock is that it's terrible at self-reflection. And I think that's just a bit sad. So, does any of that mean that Bioshock is objectively bad? No, I tricked you with a clickbait headline, and now you've watched through the whole thing, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Thanks for watching. I'd like to say special thanks to Curio, who has been helping me get this channel off the ground, and this probably wouldn't have happened without them, so thanks. Also, I have a Patreon, so if you liked what I've done here and would like to see more of those, then you can help out. I've put a link in the description. Okay, bye.